The city of Ouagadougou was still wrapped in silence. Vendors were setting up their wooden stalls. Children were walking in pairs, their school bags bouncing on their backs. A mother stirred boiling tea over a small fire, the steam rising into the cool night air. And then, inside the presidential palace, the silence was broken. At exactly 3:47 in the morning, a phone began to ring. Not once, not twice. It rang with a steady, demanding rhythm that seemed to echo through the marble corridors. On the screen, the code appeared: Moscow. Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso, was still wearing his military fatigues. He had come from a late strategy meeting, but now sleep was impossible. His aide, Captain Sankara, stood at the doorway, frozen, as if he too sensed that history was calling. When Traoré lifted the receiver, he heard a voice known across the world, the voice of Vladimir Putin. It was calm, cold, and heavy with expectation. The Russian president spoke of uranium, of military partnerships, of global power. His words carried the weight of a man used to commanding, not negotiating. He gave Traoré 48 hours to reconsider his position. For a 27-year-old leader of a poor, landlocked country, the choice was crushing. Accept Moscow's hand and gain protection, or resist and risk isolation. Yet this was not only about geopolitics. It was about dignity, about whether a nation of 20 million people could still say no when a superpower demanded yes. As Traoré listened, portraits of African heroes seemed to watch him from the palace walls. Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, Kwame Nkrumah. Men who had once stood at similar crossroads. Men who had been silenced, but not forgotten. When the line went dead, leaving only the hum of the international connection, the young president sat in silence. Outside, the call to prayer began to rise across Ouagadougou, reminding him that while the world saw uranium, his people saw bread, water, and a chance for dignity. And now the question was his alone to answer. Would he bend to Moscow, or would he stand? The palace walls seemed to close in as the weight of Putin's words settled over the room. Traoré set the receiver down slowly, as if the phone itself carried danger. He looked at Captain Sankara. Neither man spoke. They didn't need to. Both knew what had just happened. Moscow had issued an ultimatum. 48 hours. That was all the time the leader of a small West African nation had been given to decide whether his country would stand alone or kneel. Putin's message had been direct. Russia wanted access to uranium deposits buried deep in Burkina Faso's rocky soil. Russia wanted military partnerships in the Sahel, a region where French forces were retreating and American drones were circling. Russia wanted influence over a continent that was slowly slipping from Europe's grip. And to Putin, this was not a negotiation. It was an expectation. Traoré understood the stakes. He had studied maps showing the web of foreign military bases spread across Africa. He had read reports of how gold, oil, and rare earths were shipped abroad while African villages remained in darkness. He knew the language of empire, dressed up in words like security, partnership, and development. But this time, it was personal. Burkina Faso's uranium was not just rock. It was the promise of electricity for families who still cooked over open fires. It was the hope of modern hospitals in towns where children still died from preventable disease. To give it away was to give away the future. And yet, the cost of refusal was clear. Russia had power to strangle a nation through sanctions, to close doors in international markets, to whisper threats into the ears of neighboring leaders. Traoré thought of his people. He thought of Mariam, a 46-year-old farmer he had once met in the northern province. Her hands were rough from years of planting sorghum in cracked soil. She told him that all she wanted was enough water to grow food, so her children wouldn't have to walk to the city to beg. If uranium profits could build canals and schools, why shouldn't Burkina Faso accept Russia's help? But he also remembered Mariam's last words. We are tired of being used. Every time we are promised prosperity, the rich take it, and we are left with dust. Her voice echoed now as he sat in the dimly lit office. Was this just another promise that would leave his people poorer? Captain Sankara finally spoke. Sir, they will expect compliance. They always have. But if you say no... He paused, searching for the right words. If you say no, you will not just be speaking for Burkina Faso. You will be speaking for Africa. Outside, the first light of dawn crept across the capital. The city was waking. Vendors lifted baskets of oranges onto their heads. Taxi drivers started their engines. The nation carried on, unaware that their leader was weighing choices that could change their destiny. In the intelligence briefing spread across his desk, Traoré saw the dangers written in black and white. France had increased military flights overnight. American diplomats were already warning about Russian influence. European corporations were lobbying their governments, fearful of losing control over uranium contracts. And China, always watching, remained silent but calculating. The ultimatum was not just about resources. It was about whether Africa could choose its own path. Traoré closed his eyes and heard his grandfather's voice again. They will test you with fear and with greed, and they will tell you that submission is survival. The memory was sharp, like a hand on his shoulder from beyond the grave. His grandfather had lived through colonial rule, seen independence arrive, and then watched disappointment set in when leaders traded one master for another. "Do not betray the unborn," the old man had whispered in those evening talks beneath the baobab tree. Now, in that moment, Traoré felt the same choice. The phone call had ended, but the echoes remained. Putin had said, "The world is watching. Moscow expects cooperation." But what Moscow expected and what Africa needed were two very different things. Traoré knew that to resist meant danger, but to submit meant betrayal. He looked again at the portraits on the wall. Thomas Sankara, who had once declared that Africa must learn to live on its own resources. Patrice Lumumba, who had died because he refused to hand Congo's riches to foreign masters. Kwame Nkrumah, who had dreamed of a united Africa but was toppled when he threatened global interests. Their eyes seemed to ask him the same question. Would he choose dignity or comfort? He rose from his chair and walked to the balcony. Below, school children laughed as they ran to class. A woman balanced a basket of bread on her head. Ordinary life continued, fragile and beautiful, while the gears of global power turned above them. The choice was his, but the consequences would be theirs. And so, the young president made a vow to himself in that dawn light. He would not make the decision alone. He would seek wisdom, not from Moscow or Washington, but from the elders and the ancestors who had carried Burkina Faso through centuries of struggle. The sun had barely risen when Ibrahim Traoré called for the elders. Inside an ancient mud brick hall near the palace, incense curled upward, carrying the scent of history. The chiefs arrived quietly, each one carrying the weight of generations. Their robes were simple, but their authority came not from titles, but from memory of how their people had survived empire after empire. They sat cross-legged on woven mats. Captain Sankara stood respectfully at the edge of the room, aware that this gathering carried more weight than any cabinet meeting. One by one, the elders spoke. "The Russian speaks the same language as the French before him," said Chief Kabore, his hands wrapped around worn prayer beads. "Promises of protection in exchange for our gold, our land, our children's future." Another elder leaned forward, his voice firm. "Our ancestors fought with spears against cannons. They knew that defeat with dignity was better than comfort with chains." Traoré listened, absorbing their words like a student before his teachers. Finally, the eldest among them, nearly 90, raised his hand. His eyes were clouded with age, but his voice was steady. "The soil remembers. If you bow now, the unborn will curse your name. If you stand, even if you fall, they will bless you." The council ended with a blessing. Each elder placed his hand on the young president's shoulders. In that moment, Traoré felt centuries of struggle flow into him. The decision was his, but the strength was theirs. Later that morning, he walked to the sacred grove outside Ouagadougou. The baobab trees stood like sentinels, their roots deep in soil that had tasted both blood and rain. A priest waited, dressed in white robes. He burned herbs, lifted prayers, and called upon the spirits of warrior queens and fallen heroes. Traoré knelt, his forehead pressed against the red earth. In his pocket was a pouch of soil from his grandfather's grave. He whispered the words he had spoken as a boy under the same sky. "Guide me. Do not let me betray them." The wind rustled through the leaves. The priest spoke softly. The spirits answer, "Dignity is not negotiable." When Traoré rose, something had shifted. He was no longer only a soldier or even just a president. He was a vessel for his people's will. By noon, the square outside the presidential palace was full. Thousands gathered, some holding flags, others carrying hand-painted signs. "Africa will not bow." Social media had carried whispers of the ultimatum, and people came to see if their leader would stand tall or bow. International cameras pointed toward the podium. Reporters from Paris, Washington, Moscow, and Beijing jostled for space. Analysts predicted compromise. After all, how could a landlocked nation, with a fragile economy and no superpower allies, say no to Moscow? Then Traoré stepped forward. He wore no medals, no decorations, only his plain green uniform and the gaze of a man who had already decided. His first words were quiet but steady. President Putin, the world is listening. Burkina Faso does not negotiate its sovereignty. A ripple went through the crowd. Reporters froze. Then the roar came, cheers that rolled across Ouagadougou like thunder. Traoré's voice grew stronger. We are not your uranium mine. We are not your military base. We are not your client state. Africa belongs to Africans. Every sentence struck like a hammer against the foundations of old colonial assumptions. The square exploded in applause. People cried, embraced, lifted children onto their shoulders. Elderly women beat drums. Students chanted. For the first time in decades, many said, an African leader was speaking words they had waited to hear. Around the world, reactions came swiftly. In Moscow, anger. Sanctions were announced. Rumors spread of covert plans to destabilize the government. In Paris, unease. Energy officials whispered about uranium shortages. Military officers quietly raised alert levels in the Sahel. In Washington, confusion. Was this defiance of Moscow a chance for new ties, or a warning that Africa was breaking away from all foreign masters? In Beijing, silence, but also opportunity. Officials released careful statements about supporting sovereignty, while trade envoys quietly reached out. But the most important reactions were not from capitals. They came from the streets of Africa. In Bamako, Mali, crowds waved Burkina Faso's flag alongside their own. In Niamey, Niger, young men painted slogans on walls, "We stand with Traoré." In Lagos, students organized rallies shouting, "Africa is not for sale." For older Africans, the echoes were unmistakable. They remembered the speeches of Lumumba, Nkrumah, and Sankara. They remembered the betrayals and assassinations that followed. And now, they wondered, could this young man succeed where others had fallen? That night, Traoré stood once more on his balcony. The city below was alive with celebration, but he knew the real test had just begun, for he had chosen dignity. Now, he would have to survive the storm it unleashed. The speech was over, but the echoes continued. In the days that followed, Burkina Faso felt the weight of Traoré's choice. Sanctions came quickly. Russian banks froze transactions. European officials announced restrictions on trade. Fuel imports slowed, and prices at the market began to climb. Bread cost more. Soap cost more. Ordinary people felt the shift almost overnight. But what surprised many was the reaction of the people themselves. Instead of despair, there was pride. Instead of anger, there was resilience. In the crowded stalls of Ouagadougou's central market, women adjusted to higher prices with a shrug and a determined smile. One mother told a reporter, "Yes, rice is more expensive today, but my son walks with his head high. That is worth more." In a small textile factory, a young woman named Sarah kept her machines running, even as rumors spread that foreign buyers might cancel contracts. She explained simply, "I don't sew for Paris. I sew for Burkina Faso. If we must, we will wear our own clothes." Farmers in the northern provinces gathered at wells, talking not just about drought and harvests, but about sovereignty. One elder farmer summed it up. "We have survived worse. If dignity costs more, we will pay." Inside government offices, the pressure was immense. Advisors warned that reserves were shrinking. Some urged compromise. Others argued that the nation could not risk isolation. But Traoré held firm. He had told the world that Burkina Faso would not bow, and now he had to prove it. His ministers worked day and night to find alternatives, agreements with regional neighbors, barter deals with sympathetic nations, tighter controls on spending. In parliament, opposition voices accused him of risking the nation's survival. Yet outside the walls, crowds gathered daily chanting his name. To many, he had become more than a politician. He was a symbol that Africa could stand tall. Across the continent, the impact was electric. In Mali, the streets filled with drums and chants of solidarity. In Niger, soldiers painted slogans on their barracks, "Dignity first." In Ghana, university students organized debates, comparing Traoré to Nkrumah. African media replayed his speech again and again. Radio hosts asked callers, "Would you accept hunger if it meant freedom?" The answers poured in. Old men remembered colonial days. Young women demanded a future that was not bought and sold. But not everyone supported him. Some African leaders, dependent on Western aid, spoke cautiously. They feared sanctions could spread and that their own people might begin demanding similar defiance. Still, the momentum was clear. A new conversation had begun about who truly owned Africa's land, its minerals, its future. Meanwhile, in Washington, Paris, and Brussels, analysts argued over the risks. Energy markets worried about uranium supplies. Migration experts warned of instability. Retired generals appeared on television, debating whether Burkina Faso could endure without allies. And in Moscow, frustration boiled. Russian state media painted Traoré as naive, manipulated by the West. But the reality was simpler. He had refused to be owned. Back in Burkina Faso, ordinary life continued under the shadow of sanctions. In the villages, people dug deeper wells. In the cities, neighbors shared food. Community kitchens opened, run by volunteers. Churches and mosques held special prayers, not for surrender, but for strength. One Sunday morning, in a packed church in Ouagadougou, a pastor lifted his hands and said, "The Lord tests those he loves. If our trial is hardship, let us endure it with dignity." The congregation responded with a resounding Amen. For many older citizens, the hardship was familiar. They remembered famines, coups, and foreign troops on their soil. To them, this was different. This was chosen suffering, not imposed humiliation. At night, the city squares filled with music and poetry. Youth groups recited verses about sovereignty. Elders told stories of resistance under colonial rule. In the dim light of kerosene lamps, children listened wide-eyed, learning that independence was not just a date on a calendar, but a living choice. The hardships were real: longer lines for fuel, fewer imported medicines, tighter budgets for schools. Yet even as the difficulties grew, something else grew stronger: unity. And so, within weeks of the ultimatum, Burkina Faso was transformed. The sanctions meant less bread on the table, but the spirit of the people meant more pride in their hearts. Traoré had gambled that dignity could hold a nation together. For now, it seemed to be working. In Washington, the news from Ouagadougou landed like a thunderclap. Burkina Faso, a small, landlocked nation most Americans could not find on a map, had just said no to Moscow, and the world was watching. Inside the Pentagon, analysts debated whether Traoré's defiance was an opportunity or a threat. Some argued that resisting Russia meant a chance for the United States to rebuild influence in West Africa. Others warned that Traoré's message was not simply anti-Russia, it was anti-dependence, and that meant Washington could be next. On Capitol Hill, hearings were called. Senators demanded to know how a country under sanctions could inspire protests across Africa. Intelligence officials testified that hashtags supporting Traoré had reached millions of young Africans within hours. "This is not just about uranium," one official explained. "It's about pride. It's about a new generation refusing to play by old rules." In Paris, officials spoke in whispers about losing the Sahel. Memories of colonial ties still ran deep, and Traoré's words had struck a nerve. European energy ministers held emergency meetings about uranium shortages, while newspapers warned of a dangerous precedent. China, as always, watched quietly. State media repeated phrases about sovereignty and mutual respect, carefully avoiding open support for Traoré, but quietly sending trade envoys to Ouagadougou. In Beijing's eyes, this was not a crisis. It was an opening. But perhaps the most striking reactions came from Africa itself. Across the continent, leaders felt the pressure. Some feared their own people would demand the same courage. Others, especially in Mali and Niger, openly embraced Burkina Faso, speaking of a Sahel alliance where African nations would stand together. For ordinary Americans, the story was distant, yet not irrelevant. News anchors framed it as a question of global security. Would uranium supplies tighten? Would instability in the Sahel lead to new migration waves toward Europe? And, most importantly, was the United States ready for an Africa that no longer accepted instructions from abroad? Behind closed doors, U.S. Diplomats admitted what few would say on television: Burkina Faso had changed the conversation. The question was no longer whether small nations could resist pressure. The question was whether the rest of the world was prepared to live with the answer. The night of the ultimatum had passed, but its shadow remained. Burkina Faso stood firm. The sanctions were biting, the threats were real, yet the nation endured. And more than that, it inspired. Across Africa, young and old alike began to speak with new confidence. Still, history warns us: courage invites challenges. In the next 3 to 6 months, Burkina Faso will face storms. Russia will not forget the public defiance. Economic pressure could deepen. Allies may hesitate. Even within the country, there will be voices calling for compromise. But perhaps the greater risk lies beyond its borders. If Burkina Faso's example spreads, if other African nations begin to say no to foreign control, then the balance of global power will tremble. The Sahel, once dismissed as a forgotten frontier, may become the stage where a new world order is tested. For the United States, this is not just an African story. It is a question of national security. Will Washington continue old habits of control, or will it learn to listen to nations demanding dignity? The answer will shape not only Africa's future, but America's place in the world. And for Africa itself, the question is even deeper. Can dignity feed the hungry? Can sovereignty light homes at night? Or will the struggle for independence demand sacrifices greater than some are willing to bear? As the sun sets on Ouagadougou, we are left with an image. A young president standing on his balcony, watching children walk to school, mothers preparing meals, elders whispering prayers. Around him, sanctions press and powers scheme. Yet the people endure, carrying pride heavier than fear. The story of Ibrahim Traoré is not finished. It is being written, day by day, in markets, in villages, in diplomatic halls, and in the hearts of millions who believe Africa's dignity is worth defending. So we end with a question, not an answer. When dignity and survival collide, which would you choose? This is Africa's test. And perhaps in some way, it is the world's test too.